This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, tonight I'm going to talk about the rebirth of Chattanooga. First, I'm going to give you a brief recap of sessions 1 and 2, especially for those who were either asleep or missed parts of them. Then I'm going to talk about how it rebuilt itself. And to me, it is a fascinating story, one that Chattanooga does a very good job of publicizing all over the world. And then finally, just give you some illustrations of what the new city looks like. This is different from the city I grew up in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Okay, very quickly. From the very beginning, the Native Americans roamed this land. They settled this area that we call Chattanooga. They lived here, the Cherokee in particular, lived here in very, very cultured, civilized style until 1838. At that time, some Cherokees, and I mean some, agreed to give up their land, and they were all moved out to Oklahoma. That's when white people started to seriously settle the area. The railroads were the big deal in Chattanooga. That was what differentiated Chattanooga as a city from anywhere else in the South. There was a railroad heading west that went to Memphis. There was one heading north that went to Nashville. There was one heading northeast that went to Knoxville. And then there was one heading south that went down to Atlanta. And there were other railroads about that time being planned more or less as feeder lines into these four main avenues of traffic. The Civil War came in 1861 and completely tore Chattanooga apart. For the better part of 4 years, Chattanooga was either occupied by Southern armies, by huge numbers of casualties, sick people, by Northern armies, and Chattanooga, by the end of the war, wasn't really much of a city. It was in dire straits. Its first rebirth, not the one we're going to talk about tonight, was led by the carpetbaggers. These are people from outside of Tennessee who came in with money and energy and rebuilt the industrial base in particular of the city. But more than that, the banks, they were the heart of its first rebirth. What made Chattanooga, other than the railroads, special was iron ore and coal, which were plentiful in this area. And so the initial industries were very much focused on the iron ore, converting the iron ore to iron, and the use of coal. The industrial expansion was the energy of the first period of Chattanooga's growth. From about 1875 until the mid 1950s, Chattanooga was a growing city. It was called the Dynamo of Dixie. And the industrial expansion was very, very much the creator of that dynamo. At one time, Chattanooga, and I'm not just talking the city, also the county, had up to 300 industries in its landscape. The river had been tamed by the CVA, and the World Wars engendered further expansions. So by the end of the Second World War, Chattanooga was a very, very dynamic city, and that changed pretty quickly. And by 1975, the Dynamo of Dixie was moribund. It had stopped growing. Its industries were in trouble. And for the first time in more than 100 years, population in Chattanooga declined. The railroads had been supplanted by the interstate highways, and the Highway 75 And I'm not sure when Highway 24, I-24 was built, but those were the two connections of Chattanooga to the rest of the world, as opposed to four railroads that connected them to all the other major cities. What was wrong was the industrial base was technologically outdated. These businesses that had grown up around the growth period were no longer up to date. They were not able to compete economically. At that point in time, Walter Cronkite, on air, labeled Chattanooga as the dirtiest city in America, 1969. The river itself was terribly polluted. The various industries were dumping waste into the creeks and into the river. And at the same time, America was facing this environmental movement, which said you've got to clean up your air and you've got to clean up your water. And who's got to do that cleaning up are the industries that are doing the polluting. And what was happening in the about 65 through 75, and I'm in one of those categories, young people fled Chattanooga. There was very little future in Chattanooga by 1970. Now what? What was the city going to do? And the first thing that they looked at was, how do we exploit our natural features? We have mountains, we have rivers, we have an incredible amount of natural beauty. How do we take advantage of that? There were coalitions of stakeholders, and I'm going to talk about three of them in particular, but there were other people too. And in fact, there may be somebody else that should be on the list with those three that I don't know about. But it was a coalition of government, industrial people, and in particular, a financial organization I'm going to talk about later too. They started doing marketing surveys, looking around, what are other people? We weren't the only Rust Belt city in the United States. What did we have to offer? What were other people doing? How could we take and make best use out of our conditions? The county government in particular, but the city government also, realized that their tax base was in serious jeopardy, and they needed to be involved in where we went from there. So here's where we start. We start with what I call the bones. The bones was the county executive Dalton Roberts, John T. Lupton, Rick Montague, and some other leaders. Those were the key people in this operation. They had assets here that they were not fully using: the Tennessee River, Chickamauga National Park, the mountains, and in particular, these features on Lookout Mountain, Rock City and Ruby Falls, and the incline. And what they started with was something called the Moccasin Bend Task Force. That was the first clear step that they took to turn things around. The process looked something like this, and I'm going to talk about everything that's on this sheet. But the county established the Center South Riverport as its first industrial park. The Moccasin Bend Task Force developed something called the Tennessee River Master Plan. The master plan evolved into something called Chattanooga Venture. Chattanooga Venture produced something called Vision 2000. The River City Company was formed as the organization through which a lot of this business was going to be conducted. Meanwhile, up on the top line, Enterprise South followed as the fourth of these industrial parks. So that's the process that was used. I'm going to talk about everything that's on that sheet. What were the outcomes? Just going across the top line, the outcomes were the Volkswagen plant and all of its subsidiaries. And again, I'll talk about them in some detail. And finally, one I did not know nearly as much about as I think I know now. Chattanooga is now Gig City. And that is a pretty important part in its economic resurgence. The bottom part of it, what did they produce? They produced the Riverwalk, Aquarium, Riverbend, everything that you see listed on that sheet. All of that happened in the last 30 years. Key players, Dalton Roberts, who was the county mayor, John T. Lupton. He at that point in time was the president. Rick Montague, the Lyndhurst Foundation. I'm going to talk a bit about the Lyndhurst Foundation because it had a key role to play. The Moccasin Bend Task Force, you saw that on the sheet before. Riverbend played its part in the city's resurgence. Chattanooga Venture, you saw where that came out of the task force. And finally, the Tennessee River Park Master Plan and the River City Company. I'm going to talk about each of these areas and the part that they played in the Renaissance. Dalton Roberts, 1933, 2015. He was actually Hamilton County's first county executive. Up until then, they had a board of directors, right, Dan? I'm not sure what they call them, but he was a good old boy, and he had brains and he had skill. He was elected in 1978 and re-elected 3 times. He did not retire until 1994. During his tenure, and I think this is amazing, his administration won over 100 national awards for excellence. All of that happening in the 16 years that he was county mayor. He led the formation of Center South Riverport, which is on the Amnicola Highway, Chattanooga's first industrial park. I talked to you, I mentioned it not so much because I'm going to talk about it, but it was the foundation from which Enterprise South came. Others were to follow. He was instrumental in the development of both the Riverwalk and the Aquarium. The cities grew brightly because of his perseverance, begun in 1980. And that's Dalton Roberts. And I knew nothing about him. He was mayor when I was gone, and by the time I got back, he was no longer in office. But as everything that I read certainly credits him as being the center of an awful lot of what went on from then on. John T. Lupton, known as Jack, he used his fortune and influence to turn the city around. He did most of his influencing behind the scenes, and by that I mean he wasn't the president of this committee or the leader of that committee. He was the person steering the boat, but not necessarily out in front. He was born in 1926 and he died in 2009. He was the son of Carter Lupton and the grandson of John T. Lupton Sr. John T. Lupton was Coca-Cola's wealthiest owner. His Lyndhurst Foundation was a key factor in funding various action steps that were taken, in particular the aquarium, but a number of others too. He was known for his leadership of Chattanooga and his donations. He didn't just use Lyndhurst money, he also used some of his own. I'll just let you read what Bob Corker said about Jack Lupton. Again, I never met the man, but he saw the need to do something in Chattanooga. He was a very generous man. He was an inspiration to the city. And as I think I've heard about 10 times from Dan, he was the motor that kept the process running. Rick Montague, did not know him, although I know Carter Montague, or what's whatever the Montague guy is that was on the board of the Medal of Honor set.
Carrington.
Carrington Montague, there you go. Rick was born in the early 40s. He graduated from Virginia in 1968. He taught English at Baylor School. He married Jack Lupton's daughter. There's a smart choice. He was a graduate of UVA, and there he learned about the influence of the public realm and architecture in making a place attractive to people. In 1982, he was appointed by the city and the county to lead the Moccasin Bend Task Force. The focus of the task force was the 20-mile corridor of the river and the revitalization of the downtown. With 3 others, he created Chattanooga Venture. Remember, I showed you how Chattanooga Venture came out of the task force, and their role was to institutionalize the spirit of public participation. They held more than 65 different public meetings over 3 years, all over the city and county, talking to people about what they wanted to see different, what they wanted to see brought into Chattanooga, what they thought was wrong with Chattanooga, the whole 9 yards. Those meetings were held by Chattanooga Venture, and they collected information with which they developed a portfolio of 50 projects. Riverwalk is the most significant of these projects, but almost all of those 50 projects have actually been addressed. Lyndhurst Foundation. It's a Chattanooga-based grant-making foundation organized in 1938 by Carter Lupton. It was the first private foundation in Tennessee. When it was originally established, it spent most of its money on private institutions, Baylor, Macaulay, GPS, and whatnot. So it wasn't a holistic foundation to begin with, but it also was responsible or saw as its focus the enrichment of the environment in Chattanooga. When Carter Lupton, that's the father of Jack, died, Jack became the president. He changed the name to the Lyndhurst Foundation. Its first name was the Memorial Foundation, I believe. Lyndhurst was the name of the family mansion. The family mansion was over in Riverview. That's the estate that was built by John Thomas Lupton, and he changed the name to the Lyndhurst Foundation. And what they started to do was redirect their funding towards enhancing the Chattanooga community. They started focusing on education, art, and in particular, the revitalization of the riverfront. It had a major role in funding the renaissance of the city. $20 million, which is about half of what the aquarium cost, came from the foundation and from Jack Lupton, about 50-50. $10 million came from the foundation, and $10 million came from Jack Lupton personally for the establishment and building and startup of the aquarium. Moccasin Bend Task Force. Remember, that was the first thing I showed you on the sheet of the process. By the 70s, the late 70s, the city was in bad shape. It had environmental problems, it had industrial problems, economic survival. All of these were competing for a fairly limited number of resources. As views came to a head, the city and county government, together with the Lyndhurst Foundation, created the Moccasin Bend Task Force in 1982. The task force teamed with the Chattanooga Regional Anthropological Association, and that's really about the water development, to develop a plan for the promotion of the river as an asset. It developed something called the Tennessee River Master Plan. And have finally found a copy. Dan found a copy for me. I have not read it yet. I will do that as I go through revising this program. But that master plan was more of a broad-based plan. It was not so much, I don't think, a specific go do this, this, and this. We'll get to that later. The master plan was looking at the big picture. It called for $750 million of mixed-use development, enhancement, and conservation along the Tennessee River as it passes through Chattanooga. So it was, to put it mildly, a very, very broad step into the future. There was no real clear picture of where they were going to get that $750 million from. Music festivals. This was also happening at about the same time. Riverbend was started in June of 1982 as a 5-night festival here in Chattanooga. Before this year, the annual festival went on for 8 nights and ranked in the top 10% of all American festivals. That's how big a deal Riverbend became. Some nights attracted as many as 90,000 people, and 650,000 people attended over the period during its heyday. They would have as many as 100 acts in their 8 days on multiple stages. Headline performers were on the Coca-Cola stage, which was a barge converted into a concert stage. Its role shouldn't be underestimated. It had a lot to do with Chattanooga becoming a tourist destination. I mean, things like Iron Man came late in the game compared to where Riverbend was. Chattanooga Venture. These community leaders, with people from the Chamber of Commerce, people from the Planning Commission, they created this program they called Chattanooga Venture. Its goal was to get participation of the community in the whole task of cleaning up their own city, environmental, social, and economic. Their first task was to design and implement a project called Vision 2000. 1,700 people in multiple community meetings doing city planning over a 4-month period in 1984. The community participants discussed many issues. They collectively set goals, and Dan has told me that he was part of this process. They established priorities for improving the city. And there wasn't any one single thesis that was driving this process. It was a collective, get the city behind what is needed to make the city more attractive, more livable, and more economically sustainable. The result was 40 goals to achieve by the year 2000. Creating a distribution and transportation center to strengthen the downtown, solving problems, and I mean we had problems in air, water, waste, and noise pollution, and creating before and after school programs. All of this was done as part of Chattanooga Venture. Vision 2000 was to turn all of these conceptual plans into specific goals to raise the attractiveness of Chattanooga for potential investment. Its key feature was Riverwalk. That was envisioned in the River Park Master Plan, and that was the key feature of Vision 2000. Riverwalk would be the spine that supported everything Chattanooga wanted for itself, said Rick Montague, who was the director of the Lyndhurst Foundation and also one of the primary functional leaders of Vision 2000. Another thing that Vision 2000 did was organize the River City Company. The River City Company, and it's still in existence, and that was 34 years ago. It was the mechanism to drive the planning process and fuel collaboration. They were given an original $12 million from 8 local foundations and 7 financial institutions, and that money would be used as a revolving fund for beginning and completing projects. And for instance, it's still in operation. River City Company is the owner of what is now the Medal of Honor Heritage Foundation building. So they buy and they sell or transfer facilities like that into other organizations. And they keep a revolving fund to do that. One of their early projects was to acquire riverfront properties adjacent to downtown for the aquarium. That $4.5 million was funded by private gifts. The public and private sharing of costs was going to be a hallmark of this process. The aquarium opened in 1992 with 1.5 million visitors in its first year of operation. Okay, now let's talk about the master plan and Vision 2000 implementation. During the 90s, Chattanooga started turning these plans into bricks and mortar. The Tennessee Aquarium opened in 1992, the IMAX Theater in 1996. The Chattanooga Visitor Center opened in 1993. The Creative Discovery Museum opened in 1995. The Walnut Street Bridge opened as a pedestrian-only bridge in 1993. Coolidge Park, which includes the vintage carousel that you see over there, with most of its animals, if not all of its animals, carved by local carvers, opened in 1999, and that really started the Renaissance on the North Shore. On the south end of town, the convention center was expanded a block away from the new conference center. So the 90s were just an absolute explosion of growth in the city. Well, what does all that do? All of that then fosters the growth of eateries, shops, motels, hotels. I remember when I left here, other than the Reed House and I think the Hotel Patton, there was no place to stay downtown. There were very few places to eat downtown. And now it is just full of those kinds of facilities. And they all followed the evolution of these and other types of attractions. Chattanooga has become a tourist mecca. Volkswagen. Enterprise South was the 4th industrial park in the resurgence. It had 6,000 acres. Originally, it was the site of the Volunteer Army Ammunition Plant, which was operated by the Department of Defense. Their primary product throughout all their years, and they started in the Second World War, through the Korean War, and through the Vietnam War, was the production of TNT. What that TNT was used for, I'm not real clear, although we and the engineers carried a lot of TNT in our basic load. In 2002, Enterprise South was introduced as a premier industrial site, 524-acre mega site, a parcel for a single large manufacturer, and up to 15 parcels for smaller manufacturers. So Enterprise South was trolling for a major industrial customer. Volkswagen was that customer. Volkswagen made a commitment to build a $1 billion automobile assembly plant. In order to get Volkswagen here, the county, the city, and the state gave them $575 million in tax incentives. I'd say as you look back on that 15 years ago, that $575 million has certainly paid itself off. The completed facility is an automobile assembly plant that right now employs about 2,800 people. It began production of the Passat in April of 2011. Its initial goal, this is back in 2011, was an annual production of 150,000 cars. And if you just do the math, that's something like 30 or $300 million in volume. Right, Owen? 300 million, that sound right? It has expanded several times since it was established. It now produces 250,000 cars a year. In addition, and this is almost as significant, if not more, it has created 16,000 full-time equivalent subsidiary jobs. It's responsible for $1.505 billion in income in the subsidiary operations. That's not the main operation of Volkswagen. Gig City. This has been very educational for me because I did not know very much about this at all. In 2010, Chattanooga was the first city to initiate a citywide gigabit network. That's a city-owned fiber internet run by the EPB of Chattanooga. That's 10 years ago. The fiber network permits gig service was installed to make Chattanooga the most advanced smart grid system in the nation. The access to fast internet combined with a government push to develop smarter infrastructure has turned the city into a destination for tech companies and for startups looking for alternatives to big cities like New York and Silicon Valley. And as I tried to go through to make sense out of that, the list of these kinds of companies that are here in Chattanooga absolutely overwhelmed me. I don't have a number, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are more than 100 new small internet-based companies now in Chattanooga that weren't here 10 years ago. And when I think about the growth that's going on downtown, and think about all these new housing and rental properties and whatnot that have been developed, I think that's more a driver of them than anything else. Maybe I'm wrong, but that would be my guess. Chattanooga's Innovation District includes an ecosystem of tech companies and venture capital firms. They're attracting entrepreneurs, they're attracting investors, and they're attracting highly skilled workers into the city. And that's what's happening in downtown Chattanooga right now. Logistics and transportation startups are the most numerous, but it's home to companies in the digital media, in healthcare, and software development spaces. It's just booming down there. Chattanooga has become the poster child for the internet expansion movement. Headlines call it the city that was saved by the internet. It's on the top 10 list of the top cities for technology jobs in America. I did not know that. I almost can't believe that this is Chattanooga that we're talking about. So here's what the Renaissance looks like. I don't have a picture up there of Volkswagen, but y'all know what Volkswagen looks like. That's what's happened in downtown in the last 30 years. It's just absolutely overwhelming how the Chattanooga has gone from the city that I grew up in that was destined to be a Rust Belt city like Gary, Indiana, or any number of those kinds of cities to what it has become. Outcomes. Throughout the 90s, it was on the cover of all of the major magazines. U.S. News and World Report and Parade Magazine for two. Chattanooga was a focus of a lot of people. It was named a top 10 family vacation destination. It was named as one of the world's great cities, one of the country's best places to live and work and play, and one of America's most walkable city, all in the same era. It's like Chattanooga is all things to all people. The transformation began back in '92 with the aquarium, and it continues. Another $120 million in riverfront improvements started in 2005. The river work today, and I'm not quite sure of this, but I think it's almost complete, right, Dan? Hello, Dan. I think it's almost complete all the way to St. Elmo. What began as a discussion about improving a marina grew to include a new expansion to the aquarium, an addition to the Hunter Museum of Modern Art, improvements to the Creative Discovery Museum and other art installations, and the complete overhaul of the riverfront. So there was almost a second phase to the original steps taken in the 90s in 2005. The mix of Volkswagen and its subsidiaries, Gig City and its related white-collar industrial expansion, and a broad-based tourism industry has made Chattanooga a truly destination city. It's clear that our success in the 90s bred success in the 21st century, and the only question is, where will it go in the future? And that's it. Any questions? Hello?
George, when was the Chattanooga Zoo put in? You haven't that wasn't mentioned at all either at Warner Park.
You know, the zoo has always been there. It has slowly grown, and I no, it was not one of the things that I put on my list. It is still a work in progress from my perspective anyway, Norm.
Okay.
George, I've got a comment about the Volkswagen plant that Dan probably knows more about than I do, but besides the money that we gave to develop the land and bring Volkswagen in, because there were two major railroads, CSX and Norfolk Southern, to distribute Volkswagens
Right.
for that property, that was one of the major reasons Volkswagen came. 2 years ago, I represented a guy who was a mechanic out there, and he was telling me that about every fifth SUV had a diesel engine with a heater in it and was being shipped to Russia
No
to
kidding?
be imported. No kidding. Every fifth SUV that we're making here in Chattanooga was being shipped to Russia.
I never heard that. Wow.
That's amazing.
I wonder if those were ones that had their environmental systems monkeyed with.
Well, they may have been, but this was just less than 2 years ago. So I think they had cleared up the computer where it wouldn't show, but that just shows that Chattanooga has influence throughout the world, really.
You bet.
Besides the Gig City,
People
they're
come-
shipped out. They're shipped out of Chattanooga to Jacksonville, put on ships, and sent over to Europe
Right.
that way.
No kidding. That interesting. There have been a lot of cities. Dan probably knows more about this than I could begin to talk. Chattanooga, trying to understand how Chattanooga. What's the formula?
George, I've always thought that the irony of the Volkswagen plant out there was that it was a TNT plant that was making explosives to fight Germany. And 70 years later, the Germans have got a very successful automobile plant out there on the very grounds that we were using to blow them back to Kingdom Come. That's always been funny to me.
That's amazing.
I think. And
Well, the other two.
Excuse me. Go ahead.
Well, the other two things that are out at Enterprise South that are really big, of course, are Amazon and ATM. ATM brings in sugar that then is distributed to several of the bakeries around here, especially McKee, to make all those little Debbies and everything.
Is it ATM or ADM?
It's ADM. I'm sorry.
Archer Daniels. I didn't know
Yeah,
that. I did not know. I know
yeah.
Archer
They
Daniels.
they bring in the sucrose sugar in tank cars and transfer it to truck tankers, and it goes to Cleveland and Collegedale and downtown. Chattanooga Bakery that makes the I don't moon pies.
I
I
did
don't
not know
like
that ADM was here in the city. I've had
Oh,
experience with.
they've got a really big transfer station
Yeah,
out there.
they had at least 4. Yeah, they had 4 plants in the city.
No kidding.
I worked for them.
You work for ADM? I didn't know that.
Yes.
I've had some dealings with them. They operate altogether differently than the corporation that I worked for. We had a refinery that we sold to ADM. We had 35 managers running the refinery. When ADM restarted it, they ran it with 3. They are not a top-heavy organization.
George, you've done an amazing job of taking many, many years of progress and people working together and summarized it in a really great presentation. I think that what you've shown is how our community can work together, and it's really the public and the private sector working together. It's government, it's the private sector, it's business people, but everybody worked together in the community to bring it to where it is now.
Well, thank you, Dan. I haven't told the rest of the group, but what I would like to do with these 3 sessions, and I think I would start with a fair amount of how do I make them better, but take them and then translate them into something that we might put on the street that encourage other people in the city to have a better understanding about their city's history.
Hey, George, this is Earl. I'd like to echo what Dan said. And did you have a straw man or a skeleton to put this together? I'm amazed you were able to pull all these disparate facts together in such a coherent program.
Well, thank you, Earl. Yes, I did. I had an awful lot of help from Dan, and a Janine Allday was the chief of staff to the mayor,
Dalton.
to
Yeah.
Dalton, and she spent 2 hours with me helping me get a grasp. And then the rest of it was, it is hard to find, actually. The presentation that you just saw, I have not been able to find in anything other than bits and pieces. So
It's a shame. It's a shame that the Regional History Museum folded.
well,
They had a lot of this old information.
absolutely, I agree with you completely. By the way, I wanted to stick this in as a gotcha. By the way, Rick Montague is still alive, and he puts on this program for a fee where he lives. I don't know what his program looks like. It's probably a lot more sophisticated than this, and it might even be a lot more accurate, but that's okay. But anyway, he was the president of the Chattanooga, of the board of directors of the History Center at one point in time. And he was not the president when they got into trouble. That was someone else. And you're absolutely right, Jerry. This is what the History Center was supposed to be about. But it's gone.
Hey, George. George, I had a question about the name of the gig city and maybe a little history of that. I had heard that Oak Ridge Labs had done a lot of development of trying to get high-speed internet and improve the bandwidth and all, and they chose Chattanooga as one of their test cases of trying to build the infrastructure from the ground up, and then all that infrastructure was just left in the hands of Chattanooga. Is some of that true or untrue? Or
You got me. I have no idea, but it sounds like it makes sense.
Yeah,
it's
they worked with a EPB, you know, and
right.
EPB helped, yeah,
Yeah,
Oak
I
Ridge build this.
believe the whole, and
I
I
did
may
not
have this
know
wrong,
that
but
Oak
I
Ridge
believe the
has
whole fiber optic network started as one of the, I guess it wasn't shovel ready project, but one of the projects of the Great Recession that we had in 2008. And EPB got some money, and the idea was to build a smart grid so they could do time of day rates and identify where they had outages and that kind of thing. So
Oh,
it was
really?
really from EPB, and then the fallout was it also provided internet service to all the EPB's customers if you paid for it. It's a separate part of EPB.
Did not know that at all, Earl. Thank you.
And the other advantage to that is that it encourages home-based businesses because you now have the ability to get work type computers in your home.
Well, EPB was able to borrow millions of dollars from the federal government, which they have paid back to put in the system
Huh.
as part of that 2008 program where they were trying to pull us out of the recession.
What I hear from all of that is my Gig City part of the slideshow has a lot of room for improvement.
Well, there's a lot of detail, yeah, to add to that. So
The person
Well,
to talk to,
the
George,
part you
is
got people taking advantage of it once it was in place. You know, I think when they started out, like I said, it was primarily for EPB and their power control and that kind of thing. But once they got it there, and there was a lady, Esposette, her husband was a crew coach that headed up that effort at EPB. And, you know, it wasn't a sure thing that it was going to go. They had to get a lot of subscribers and all, but once it got in place, then people began to see, you know, what they could do with it.
George, there's a guy up here on the mountain. His last name is Ferguson. His son's name's Scott, who's in insurance.
I know him.
But Scott's father was head of EPB and on the board during all this time period. He's now retired, but he would know all of this information about the Gig City and how EPB got the money and put in the system.
Okay.
That's Joe Ferguson.
Joe, that's right.
Okay. Well, like I said, there is a great deal of room for improvement in the 3 programs on Chattanooga, and I would appreciate more than comments. Anybody who'd like to work, Dan and I are going to be working on this. Dan has agreed to be my chief of staff, and the idea is take these 3 programs and make them something that we can show in other places just to better educate the citizens of Chattanooga to their own city. And I am very, very receptive to ideas that would make the programs better. I realize that, you know, they're just a start. And I appreciate all the comments and all the feedback. And I will